All right, welcome everyone to our event today, Disinformation and the 2020 US presidential election. My name is Areeq Chowdhury and I'm the founder and director of WebRoots Democracy. I'm very pleased to be joined by Carl Miller, research director at the Center for the Analysis of Social Media, Marianna Spring, specialist disinformation reporter at the BBC, Siddharth Venkataramakrishnan, European technology correspondent at the Financial Times, and Christine Jakobson, is a tech ethics researcher at the University of Cambridge. Today's event is part of the WebRoots Democracy Festival, which is marking the end of the organization after 6.5 amazing years. Indeed, this is the last ever WebRoots Democracy event, so it is a very special occasion today. If you're following along and wish to tweet about today's discussion, please do so using the hashtag WebRootsFest. If you're following us on Zoom or Facebook Live, please feel free to send questions throughout and we'll try to put them to our panelists towards the end. So let's get to it. So when we were planning this event, the question was really going to be what the hell happened, but it's still happening, right? It's still going on. So what the hell has actually been happening? QAnon, Stop the Steal. Marianna, you've been following this incredibly closely. In your view, what's been different about disinformation during this election versus the 2016 one? What kind of key themes have we really seen in this election?
I think there are a number of key differences that I found while reporting on specifically viral disinformation and conspiracy theories this US election. One of them has been the fact that we're often asked, or I'm often asked a lot of the time, especially when I'm on air, about foreign influence campaigns, foreign interference. But so far, a lot of the interference or influence campaigns we've seen have tended to be domestic, that there's an already very polarized online conversation dominated by conspiracy theories or those who support them. For instance, the QAnon conspiracy theory, that's that baseless conspiracy that Trump is waging a secret war against satanic pedophiles. And so that's certainly something we may find in the months to come, that those conspiracy communities and other polarized spaces were exploited by foreign actors, and I think, to be honest, it would be quite an easy task, but whether that's necessary is a whole nother question. I think that conspiracy theories have been one of the really dominant features of the election this time round. Obviously last time there was Pizzagate and QAnon subsequently emerged from that, but conspiracy theories have become a much more mainstream kind of conversation. We saw conspiracy theories about whether Trump did or didn't have coronavirus, which were false. We saw QAnon, obviously, and allegations of the vilest crimes leveled at the Democrats, leveled at specifically Joe and Hunter Biden, his son. And then obviously we have seen a deluge of voting disinformation online, which is now the big topic of conversation. And if people are interested in it, I've actually got a report coming out this weekend, which is all about the deep roots of this viral disinformation about voting, how it began months back. And this isn't a new theme for President Trump. It's something he's obviously spoken about in previous elections. The difference this time is that it appears to have reached the social media feeds of many more people, and also that people are more susceptible to it. I think conspiracy theories like QAnon explain that, because at their base we often focus on the satanic pedophile element, but at their base they are about this idea of a deep state that is conspiring against President Trump and trying to rig everything at every turn. So it's hardly surprising that a lot of people who'd come across that school of thought, whether they realized it was QAnon or not, have subsequently been keen to share the whole wave of videos about ballot dumping, ballot burning, people saying that they threw away ballots, which have all proven to be false or inconclusive or unsubstantiated, all over social media, and this huge Stop the Steal movement, which came out of election night, especially when the hashtag started to go viral, but also Trump, the way that Trump's tweets have his unsubstantiated claims about voter fraud have subsequently fed into these big online movements and vice versa. They feed off one another. So it's been a conspiracy theory hot pot, and that we're very much feeling the consequence of that right now, with the risk being not just the idea of unrest or actual kind of real world consequence of people taking to the streets, but rather the fear that this could undermine US election integrity, and for lots of people it could erode trust in institutions that have been fundamental to US democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the last election, a lot of the focus rightly was around the foreign intervention aspect of it. from an outside, I mean, I've not been following it super closely, but from an outside perspective,
Definitely.
it seems like it's a lot more domestic this time as well, right? Is there much evidence to show yet whether that's true, and it is a lot more domestic interference, or are there still kind of foreign actors trying to, rile up division and conspiracy? Are the Stop the Steal campaigns, for example, actually run domestically in the US?
I think that the important difference this time around is obviously in the build up to the election, there were various examples of foreign influence campaigns which appeared to be largely not very influential, that were taken down by the social media sites. And those are the ones that have been spotted. I think there are two crucial points to make. Firstly, that foreign influence campaigns evolve, and they are obviously becoming more sophisticated and harder for us to spot. So that's not to say that we won't realize in a couple of months' time that some Stop the Steal groups were being run by people in a basement in St. Petersburg, or QAnon profiles were created by Chinese accounts. You know, we're yet to have the conclusive answer to that question. But I think it speaks to an important point, that the world of viral disinformation and conspiracy theories and influence campaigns is increasingly complex, and it involves lots of elements communicating with each other. That's grassroots movements, like Stop the Steal appears to be, interacting with the White House, with prominent Republican figures, and then the possibility of bad actors infiltrating these spaces in a bid to kind of further exacerbate the problem. I'm often asked about the difference between mis and disinformation, and it can actually be really difficult to prove the intention, or to separate the people who are perhaps unwittingly taken in by this disinformation and those who are deliberately spreading it. So it becomes a very complex mess to untangle, which is what I, and I'm sure lots of the fellow panelists today, are currently grappling with.
Definitely. I'm going to bring in Carl. So Carl, someone I've known for many years. Carl, you have, in my opinion, great foresight on issues around tech and democracy. We did an event in January in Parliament, a similar event, looking at disinformation and the would be a possible turning point for whether we have democratic elections at all in future. But even earlier than that, 10 years ago, you wrote a paper with Demos looking at conspiracy theories. And as part of that, you mention some of the challenges around how the internet would negatively affect the way we process information, and therefore make us more vulnerable to conspiracies, which is really has come to fruition a lot, I think, with this election. Just to start off, I think it'd be good to find out whether your warnings were heeded by the people in power. If not, why not? And if so, what do you think was done since that paper 10 years ago?
I work for a think tank, Areeq. Our warnings are never heeded. And that means that we can always then look back 10 years later and say how we so successfully predicted the future. Just before I jump into it, though, I mean, what a special moment. I just want to kind of pause for a moment to kind of pay tribute to you and WebRoots, really. I didn't know this was the last actual event. And I just wanted to say that, yeah, it's been a wonderful thing, WebRoots, over the years. And over the many years that I've spoken at events and gone to them, it's been something which I've really kind of treasured seeing grow, and your work and the work of all the amazing volunteers that have made it happen. So congratulations, Areeq, and it feels very special that I can be part of the last event for it. Right, conspiracy theories. The paper we wrote 10 years ago kind of made two broad points, which I think are true, really. The first was that conspiracy theories were an increasingly potent kind of idea in British and international politics, and I think that, of course, has become far too patently obvious now. You know, they're so flexible, they're so able to ingest any kind of countervailing information, they're so extensible and malleable and pernicious in the way, of course, that they kind of target a series of institutions. Exactly the institutions that are supposed to actually protect the truth are the very ones which are implicated in the conspiracy theory landscape as being the deniers of it. So that was the first point. But the second point was that conspiracy theories are also social agents. They change society too, and they're radicalizers. That was actually the main point of that paper. That wasn't actually particularly obvious 10 years ago. We were dealing with the 9/11 truth movement, which seemed like the kind of fluffy, innocuous version compared to the kind of Frankenstein theories of QAnon today. And we weren't dealing with 5G masts getting burned down either. And I think that's kind of been one big kind of thing that empirically has become more obvious, is the way that these things are actually tumbling people out into the streets, direct action. And I actually think that we're only seeing the beginning of that. The next big battle is going to be around the vaccine, of course, and I think we've only began to see the very beginnings of what a kind of mobilized alt health conspiracy theory world will do to try and prevent people receiving the vaccine. What we didn't predict, I think, was the way in which conspiracy theories would interact with this idea of information warfare. I don't tend to focus on mis or disinformation personally. I kind of tend to focus on the existence of kind of concerted and coordinated attempts to manipulate online spaces, be they domestic campaigns, be they international ones. That to me kind of ropes together a series of tactics, of which the propagation of explicit falsehoods is just one tactic of many. So I think that equally pernicious and perhaps even more damaging is simply the selection of some truths over other truths. I think that the way in which you can manipulate a sense of the world through simply making some truths more visible, I think is in many ways like far more like kind of dangerous really than just propagating outright lies. And that idea of information warfare, of seeing warfare, of conflict, not just being fought using the tools of information, but actually in information, I think that's the key new dimension of this idea, the idea that information is a space that you maneuver in, that you fight within, that you dominate. That I think more than anything else has been proved by the last election, more than anything else. And I think whatever kind of actor you were, I think that you were fighting that election with the idea that information really has, the main benefit of it is purely as an instrument of either garnering behavioural or attitudinal outcomes. And I think across the battle lines, that was what we saw happen. And of course, one of the casualties there then is the truth, the idea that information has benefits unto itself, that sharing truths has values unto itself. And like the really scary thing, just to finish this kind of slightly rambling narrative, is we kind of realize that in this world then, where information is a theatre of war and where truth is in many ways a kind of incidental thing that you can or not use, depending on whether it's useful to your side, lying and manipulating information had no and has no real consequences outside of a series of norms which in the domestic US space at least have just gone away. And that really has meant that the big change between 2016 and 2020, I think, is that the actual penalties for getting caught doing information warfare have basically evaporated. And that meant that in 2016, you know, what we were kind of gearing up for this election this time was, again, we were going to be in the kind of shadows, you know, trying to unearth Iranian and Saudi Arabian and Russian techniques. And when we did, there would be big scandals and we would, you know, clear them off the networks. Instead, we actually just saw a domestic US political campaign take the rules and lessons of information warfare and use them in a totally unapologetic way. And I think that more than anything else, probably just sucked all the oxygen away from any state-based campaign. I think if you were Iran or Saudi Arabia, you were probably panicking because you couldn't get any visibility, because you couldn't outflank the US domestic conversation by being madder than they were, because they were as mad as it could get.
This is so true. I wonder whether, I mean, I really like the way you frame it in terms of information warfare as well, because, I mean, whether it's domestic or international, it does feel a lot more like a war than anything else. I wonder, therefore, whether you. So one of the things, again, in the paper from obviously 10 years ago, was a need to focus on critical analysis skills as a response. I wonder whether you still think that's sufficient enough, or whether we've gone beyond that point now, and instead actually whether we should be, you know, instead of funding like military, traditional military resources, we should be thinking a lot more about protecting our information space? And if so, what does that actually look like?
Yeah. No, we got that totally wrong. So we called, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with digital literacy. I'm glad we called for it in 2012. I wish it was part of the national curriculum, but it doesn't solve a problem like information warfare. It kind of, this isn't reducible to, I mean, one of the things I think is so obvious when you actually talk to people that have done it. They're hard to interview, they'll never come on camera, but you can sometimes talk to the actual people that develop the tradecraft, is that they never try and lie to people to change their mind. This isn't like fundamentally a rationalist process. This has to do with the manipulation and massaging of identity and meaning and belonging and sense of right and wrong in the world more than anything else. These are emotional and identity-based drivers of human behavior. That's really what the people that fight with information really try and focus on, because they know that that's far more powerful. Package an idea in a cat, it looks like a baby, it will go around the internet. Don't just say a truth. And, you know, I just don't think we can have a reasonable expectation that we can equip a population with a series of skills that will provide a kind of meaningful resilience to campaigns which are fought by such sophisticated actors as foreign intelligence agencies. We can't spot it, and we throw data science at it. An individual can't spot most of what now I think is connected to information warfare. They're not going to spot it in the future for sure. They're not going to spot it 10 years after they've actually had the lessons on it. And most of the time they don't want to spot it, because most of the time information warfare is making them angrier about things, making us all angrier about things that we already believe are true. It's swimming with our cognitive biases, not against it. You know, it's when you're nodding your head, that's when you're most likely to be manipulated by these campaigns online, not when you're shaking them. So for all those reasons, I don't think digital literacy really was ever going to be the way out. I know that it's the kind of liberating, emancipating, nice idea, but you know, and it was one of the reasons, you know, that we at Demos were attracted to it, but it was never going to be our real way out. Our way out is going to be, I think, unleashing a far broader array of different responses than I think we typically have been, to be honest. And I think that goes all the way from actually quite coercive measures by states. I actually think we should be attacking the infrastructures of large, sophisticated foreign adversaries that are attempting to do things like interfere in elections directly. There should be cyber offensive operations against the most sophisticated actors. I think for us in the civic society area, probably our main task now is to kind of move beyond simply noticing that disinformation and misinformation, information warfare campaigns are there. I think we're quite good at saying, here's a campaign, there's a campaign, there's a campaign. Probably what we need to do more of now is to begin to actually unearth the kind of hiddennesses around those campaigns, to sting the people that are doing it, to understand the kind of PR companies that go around actually pitching these things, to understand the kind of hidden connections of money and affiliation and organization which underlie them, basically to do more shoe leather journalism to kind of tell the bits that we can't see on social media. And in doing that, probably allow us to start like inflicting penalties and costs against companies and actors. So no-fly lists, economic sanctions, libel law, defamation law, like civil suits, lots of things like that.
Cool. I'm going to bring Sid in. So you've been following a lot. So a lot of these conspiracy theories or disinformation, whatever you want to call it, some of them you can understand quite easily why someone might believe it. So for example, the election being rigged, if you're a Trump supporter, you look at the media and whatever, what Donald Trump's saying, you can understand maybe why you believe that theory. Something you've been looking at a lot is QAnon, which you know, has been a lot of media attention. Indeed, there was a member of Congress now is a supporter of QAnon, and you've also been following a lot of the far-right activity online. Are you able to, first of all, talk to us, explain this, and Marianna touched on it already, explain it a bit more, but also discuss why it is that this particularly wild theory is getting so much traction, and what it is that's drawing people to it, and whether we should be concerned, and if so, why?
I mean, actually, Marianna made a very good point at the start that much of QAnon, the fundamental base, isn't the particularly ludicrous element. It's actually the deep state, the real distrust of institutions, except the military, except Donald Trump and whatever he favors that time until they fall out of favor. And it's a really, it is, I think we should be terrified of it. Not so much QAnon in itself, which is scary, but I think the fact that white label Q, as it were, the way in which Q has its highly amorphous nature has been borrowed by many conspiracy theories. It's been adopted across national borders. In the UK, with Trafalgar Square protests, you can speak to people there who'll say, we don't care about the Trump part of QAnon, but QAnon speaks to us at a deep level because we don't trust the government, we don't trust them on vaccines. And I think that in the US context, it's fundamentally been not about the sort of Hofstadter paranoid state of being, paranoid state of mind, but the to borrow a term from First Draft, the idea of a epistemological warfare, fundamentally a breaking of a information ecosystem in such a way that people who are engaging from both in QAnon circles, somewhat easily parodied as people who believe in satanic worship, but then that obviously that kind of broader epistemological breakdown spreads across the conservative sphere. And I think people who may not believe in the sort of paedophile cult part of it, but would still believe in the fundamental aspects of Trump being sort of the chosen one fighting against a deep state cabal, would also not be able to engage with the truth in essence. And I think the fact that we have sort of this truth breakdown and sort of what Paul's talked about and sort of the failure in some ways of media literacy, and the fact that people are reading they have their own version of media literacy in essence. It's not that people don't necessarily engage with news and sources, but that they are engaging with it through an entirely different framework. And that makes the whole ideas of things like an infodemic and sort of healing the sphere fundamentally mistaken, I think, because the problem over the last 4 years has been the effort made by actors, in most cases domestic, but even if we include foreign, to fundamentally foster that entire distrust in truth and the removal, as Carl said, of the penalties for not speaking the truth and for creating alternate parallel narratives.
Yeah, and I know it's not linked to the election, but also a lot of the conspiracies around COVID have been kind of similar in the sense of deep state conspiracy, the Great Reset, Bill Gates injecting microchips or whatever. And I have a friend, right, who, quite educated person, got a respectable job, this and that, quite smart person. He really is sucked into this, especially the COVID one, the vaccine stuff. I don't know whether maybe you could speak about what kind of people are actually drawn into this, and are there certain vulnerabilities that you've noticed as to why people believe? Obviously some of the deep state stuff maybe isn't as wild, but even the crazier stuff is the Bill Gates stuff is I still consider to be quite wild theories. And is it quite widespread? And do you think it will dissipate now that Trump has lost and presumably will go, or do you think it's something that's on the rise and will grow further?
I think it's really interesting to compare it to Pizzagate, which had a lot of similarities in terms of sort of the particularly wild claims, but was very much driven. It was in many ways much more fringe. It was driven by people sort of on the chans. It was a lot of alt-right and alt-right influencers who were there, got their names there, and then dropped it when it was no longer politically viable after the shooting at Ping Pong Pizza. Whereas what you've seen more generally with QAnon is that it's appealed to a much wider, generally older audience on platforms like Facebook. It's spread on YouTube, and that's combined with the COVID conspiracies and vaccine conspiracies. And then you've also seen the same alt-right influencers, people sort of like Katie Hopkins, you've seen Jack Soviet, you've seen a lot of people who were around in 2017 who were pushing earlier conspiracy theories, return and sort of repackage and rebrand their material. So in terms of vulnerabilities, I think it's fundamentally, COVID has obviously changed the picture, and it's worth noting that there was a massive skyrocketing demand for QAnon content in groups around the start of March, and that's obviously continued until they were removed. Although it's questionable where they've gone, and undoubtedly many of the people are still hanging around on different groups on Facebook. I think post-Trump it should be interesting to see. I think in many ways it's not going to dissipate. Perhaps there'll be a myth of a sort of the stab in the back myth, the betrayal. But even so, I think a general distrust of politics as it is, a general clamoring for cult-like figures or sort of God emperor figures who will try and take up the Trumpian mantle. And it's questionable if anybody has the right combination of sufficient resources and a sufficient sort of history to make that claim. But I've been thinking, I think in smaller local elections and in areas which are perhaps less covered, and in places, we've seen a lot of Q content, a lot of conspiracy content in closed local groups, which are particularly hard to track and where, you know, this content is really hard to counter. I think I'm quite concerned about when this sort of rhetoric filters through that, captures the minds of people who think, actually, this is my way to become a political figure, either an influencer or take political office.
So before I bring in Christine, I just want to remind people watching, if you want to submit questions, please use the Q&A function, and I'll put them to our panelists towards the end. So Christine, so with the framing we have, right, so it's information warfare. We are at war with a very abstract enemy, and at the front line of that are the tech companies, right? That's where all of this stuff is actually taking place. You've been working, you did some work with the Mozilla Foundation, tracking the US election responses of Facebook, Instagram, Google, YouTube, Twitter, and TikTok. I'm fascinated to know what you found and what you think worked and didn't work. So maybe if you could tell us a little bit about also what you did. You know, is there evidence yet of whether things like the disclaimers on Donald Trump's tweets make any kind of difference to the people who may succumb to those claims?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Areeq. So what I've done, in fact, is I've teamed up with Mozilla Foundation, and we looked at these 6 platforms because they have obviously an outsized influence in terms of what kind of information we see online, and because more and more people consume their information online rather than through traditional media, we really wanted to zoom in onto some specific elements of that. So we've published in October an election misinformation policy tracker to help journalists, watchdogs, voters, and onlookers like us from slightly afar to keep a track on what's going on. So at first we were really interested in what are the guardrails that these platforms put in place in order to keep information safe, and have they learned from 2016 and what do these policies look like. So what we've done is we've created a scorecard of more than 20 questions that fall roughly into 4 different categories. So the first thing that we looked at that we were predominantly interested in is how do these platforms limit this and misinformation? So here we were really interested in assessing how these platforms, whether they have policies against this and misinformation content, whether misinformation standards are applied to election content specifically and political content, whether specific claims such as false victories and delegitimizing election processes are in place, and whether policies are applied to elected officials in the same way that they are applied to you or me. So there we really wanted to look at content, and we can speak about that. The other category that we looked at was advertising. So advertising being a specific element of wanting to know by who do they accept ads, how are they being checked, how are they being paid for, and how transparent is it, who can see who is paying money for what, essentially. And do they have any kinds of checks in place to verify whether the information in those ads are true or not. Then we were also looking at consumers. So you and me, obviously being on any of those 6 platforms, what is it that we can do when we spot misinformation? Do they have anything in place that we can say, hey, hang on, like this has fallen like through your cracks? And what happens then with that kind of content? And lastly, we were interested in whether these platforms and to what extent support researchers, because researchers, as we believe, obviously play a very critical role in tracking and reporting disinformation and holding these platforms to account. So one of the few things that might be worth mentioning is, so while we've had predominantly other journalists in mind, as well as researchers, we've also sent out of courtesy, I guess, our report in advance to these 6 platforms and said, okay, for transparency, have a look at what we've come up with, scoring you across these different categories. And it's been really interesting because the response by these platforms has been very varied. While some of them have been very concerned that we would grade them rather low, they have come back and said, give us some recommendations, we want to do better. Like, we just currently don't know, how, tell us what we can do. Some others thought that it was a fair characterization. They have come back and said, you know what, fair enough. Like, we know that we are bad on certain points, and we know we have to work on them in the future. While some others have come back and said, you know what, this is a very unfair representation of what we are doing. Really, you should be scoring us much higher because have you not seen all the great work we've done? And that's obviously relating to some of the takeaways that I wanted to share in relation to the research that I've done for Mozilla. One is that these policies that we've looked at, they have been really rapidly evolving. I think I started tracking policy updates from early September, and I'm still tracking them now. So we are continuously updating our tracker. And you can take my word for it, at the beginning it looked much worse, and like the platforms are keeping up with some of the points that we have flagged. But something that has become very clear is that some of these policies that seemed very cutting edge over the summer, such as having policies in place against delegitimizing election processes, obviously, as we were sooner coming up to the day of the election, seemed that this is really the baseline of policies that they should have in place. So I think that there was an interesting twist in how fast things have developed. The other thing that I've noticed is a lot of the platforms seem to adapt similar policies in relation to misinformation to one another. So if one platform is coming out and say like, oh my God, here we have like this new policy in place against, let's say, amplification, most of the other platforms will follow. So there is an interesting dynamic to keep in mind, obviously, in how these policies evolve. And while there are many similarities across these platforms, it's also important to point out that there are also some very important differences between these platforms, particularly in relation to whether they remove false content, whether they delete accounts, whether they're willing to go that far, whether they treat elected officials the same way, how they're dealing with advertising, and so on and so forth. And their Facebook particularly stood out in that regards. So the other point that I wanted to highlight, so one is the policy point that we've looked at, and we have to say that policies have been evolving much stronger this time around in 2020 than it was in 2016. However, what we're seeing obviously in this election is that it's not just the run up to the election, but it is during the election, and particularly this time after the election, which we are thinking will be till at least inauguration in January, that we will see particular misinformation campaigns in relation to the election. So we are not thinking just in terms of days or weeks after the election day, but really till inauguration. What we have found here is, ever since we've been tracking this, is that obviously you could think of the US election in terms of sitting a test for these platforms. While we have looked at the beginning how they were preparing for this test, whether they've been doing their homework, whether they've passed the policies, whether they've communicated this, what we're really doing now is we started to look at enforcement. And enforcement is really a question on how did you do on the test that you set yourself out to do. So it's really like taking this check on, have these policies these platforms have put in place in order to guardrail against misinformation, have they succeeded at doing that? And here the answer is a little bit more complicated, because it is questionable whether they have successfully done that, but it also has highlighted real differences across platforms. And I think it is important to see that this question of enforcement is really a question about accountability. While these policies have been relatively transparent and everyone can follow what these platforms do, enforcement of these policies is very much hidden. And I think that speaks to Carl's point about this idea of, are these platforms accountable, who is accountable, and what sort of governance structure should we have in place in order to guardrail against mis and disinformation? And here the question is it the platforms that can protect us? Are they the ones that can govern themselves? And I mean, obviously, clearly here, an answer would be no. And I think the last point that I'd like to raise quickly is in relation to something Marianna also said at the beginning, which is the very idea that President Trump is the one who is the center of misinformation this time around, rather than foreign interference as we've previously seen. And this has a very specific, I would say that this is a very specific problem for these platforms, because not only is it a domestic problem, but it has become a partisan problem. So something that we have seen, for example, in relation to the Republican Party is that platforms can only lose one way or another. In one sense, it is like we either let people say whatever they want to say, in which case, obviously, everyone would say like you're spreading misinformation, or they're going to put some guardrails in place where then the Republican Party will say, oh no, you're just censoring us. So there the question of just domestic has become its own kind of question of how do you treat that. So I think these are some of the things that we've seen that are different, and some of the things where we need to put further pressure onto these platforms.
A lot of the conversation in the kind of civil society space, I mean, in the UK now, there's a very active debate around online harms and domestic regulation of these platforms. But it seems that a lot of the activity that is taken by these platforms is just, almost like public relations management. They know that they're going to be under fire from a media perspective, and maybe from politicians in the US. Do you feel like there's been that much of the response was due to like activities of the UK government or any other domestic government? And do you think it's maybe, with your experience in doing this research, do you think it's realistic that a domestic country could ever have that kind of impact in actually controlling over what these policies should look like before elections?
I think it's a very complex problem, obviously, in terms of like the kind of policies that are put in place. I think my real question is the question of accountability. What do we do specifically, also to Carl's point, what do we do when something goes wrong? Because currently it's kind of more like slapping them on the finger and saying like, oh, like you really should have done better, right? And I think that that's the biggest problem in relation to who has a say in how the space is being shaped. So yeah, and I think like one of the other things that might be worth mentioning is something that needs to be maybe paid closer attention to is how these also specifically conspiracy theories, so to your point, are spilling from platforms into real life, right? So there we had the questions of how does violence, for example, how are calls to violence occur online and then spilling into real life, such as Pizzagate. So I think that we need a much more joined up account of how to govern these platforms and what to do when things go wrong.
So I'm going to bring Marianna and Sid back in. So if we have the tech companies on one side of our defense, the other side of the fence is the media, right? And I, like many other people, spent about a week glued to US TV channels, watching all of the coverage, highly addictive, highly dramatic. But it was a really interesting challenge, I mean, for the media, because like our panelists have been saying, unlike 2016, a lot of the misinformation or disinformation has come from the Trump campaign. And the seriousness of it is so much more significant because, whilst last time it was around Hillary Clinton and Pizzagate, this time it's a narrative that half the country had their election stolen from them, which can undermine faith in all future elections, not just this one. And it hasn't even fully played out yet. We don't actually know where this will go. And I watched bits of this press conference yesterday where they're carrying on this narrative, and Rudy Giuliani's hair dye seems to be all over the place. But Marianna, to start with, what's your perspective on how the media is done? And I mean, you're directly at the front line because this is your role, right, as a disinformation reporter. Is it taken very seriously by media companies like the BBC, that this is a big part of their role to combat this rather than just reporting the news? And what do you think has changed and should be done from the media perspective?
I think it's really interesting. I mean, obviously this beat has grown massively, and there are a number of dedicated reporters and correspondents, particularly in the US, but kind of growingly so in the UK, or tech correspondents who turn their attention to this topic, and I think that is emblematic of the fact that a lot of news organizations and media outlets have realized how important it is to cover this beat specifically of disinformation, conspiracy theories, and the kind of ins and outs of the social media world, because it relates so much to what's going on in our lives. My job only existed as of the end of February, conveniently before the pandemic, and I'm the first specialist disinformation reporter the BBC has ever had, and we have a brilliant anti-disinformation team made up of journalists who do fact checking at BBC Reality Check, BBC Monitoring, who forensically analyse and scour the internet for what's going on, and BBC Trending, who cover the world of kind of different social media cultures and conspiracies. I think what's crucial, and is something for us at the BBC, is that which relates to this issue of both impartiality and campaigning. We don't campaign or lobby for any particular action. What we do is report on and expose what's going on. And the question of disinformation is not one of opinion, it's fact. So, you know, disinformation is wrong. That's an objective fact, in the same way that racism is, in the same way that homophobia is. And that's very much been the editorial line for us covering this area. Although obviously it's always important when we do our reporting to highlight legitimate concerns and issues. And I think that the question of President Trump and unsubstantiated claims he's tweeted have proved a challenge in some respects in that way. But when you're covering the viral disinformation, the obviously false claims and videos circulating online, in some ways it's easier because you're able to directly investigate and call out things which are false, misleading, incorrect. Same with covering conspiracy theories and topics such as QAnon. Obviously, something we grapple with quite frequently is the issue of amplification and how we can responsibly report on disinformation. I think there are various facets to my role and to the role of our team. I spend a lot of time focusing on the people who are impacted by viral disinformation in order to expose why it's important and the real world consequences that it can have, whether that's destroying relationships, whether that's putting people's health at risk and actually leading to direct or indirect harm, whether that's undermining democracy. My role as a reporter is to expose all of those harmful consequences. And I think by focusing on the real human stories, humanizing the impact of misinformation, we can better communicate why this beat matters and why it's such kind of, you know, becoming just as important as covering the economy or covering other elements of tech and those kinds of issues. I think also when it comes to the issue of, I know that Carl kind of spoke about social media literacy and how it's not the solution. And while I agree it's not the solution to the issue of mis and disinformation that's really taken us all by storm, I think it's a crucial element of BBC News's coverage, particularly in equipping both younger and older audiences in how they themselves can try and protect themselves against the slightly more unwitting forms of misinformation, which is something we saw especially at the start of the pandemic, and kind of educating audiences in how they can talk to those they care about conspiracy theories, because those who may have been radicalized, and I really think this is a form of radicalization by conspiracies, are more likely to listen to a relative, a friend, someone they trust and know than the BBC or other institutions who they fundamentally distrust. So I think that's kind of a crucial element of what I do, but part of a bigger picture of kind of different. And I think to add to that, fact checking is incredibly important. But there's a really interesting Obama interview, I'm not sure if people saw it, that was on the BBC, and he made a crucial point, in my opinion, about how fact-checking is really important and so great that the world has embraced it, but tackling this topic is so much more now than fact-checking, and actually trying to understand the ecosystems, understanding who spreads this, who's impacted, why, the consequences that it have is crucial. In many ways it is like radicalization and should be covered in that way.
I'm gonna bring Sid in a second and then go to questions. So if you think about all the stories of elections, you know, whether it's like a rigged election in Nigeria, let's say, all we as individuals really have is trust specifically in the media. So even with this US election, I trust the media that they say that Joe Biden won and everything was fairly done. And given the scale of the problem, given that we know that digital literacy is a part of it, but it won't be the whole story, the media have such a fundamental role in the battle against it. And I know the Financial Times is a very well-funded paper, and I worked in financial services once upon a time. We had a whole company-wide subscription, but a lot of the rest of the media isn't well-funded. And I wonder whether I could just get your opinion on what you think the role of the media should be in the future as a kind of defense role for the country and citizens. But also your opinion on what you think about alternate funding models. Like if we're in this scenario where all future elections are going to be like this, and will probably get worse. The role of the media comes more than disinformation, becomes a form of defense that we have as citizens. It'd be great to just get your thoughts on that, Sid.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think perhaps even more than defense, sort of offense, because I think we are on the back foot at this point. I think we've seen a really worrying rise in the alt media landscape, which has taken up. You saw when Fox News called Arizona sort of Newsmax, OAN, all these voices leapt into the breach who have, I don't think there's been enough digging into their funding models, but from what I understand, a lot of these companies have a lot of dark money, which makes it much easier to compete against legacy or establishment, or however you want to call media. I think, I agree with Marianna's point that, that media does have a very key role in ensuring that people do understand sort of what's going on. I've been trying to avoid sort of becoming trapped in doom cycles at this point, to be honest. When speaking to researchers who say, essentially we don't see a way out of this. I do think that the media, obviously we had sort of the Trump bump earlier on in the Trump presidency. I do wonder whether we might have something like that coming on later. I don't know if this is perhaps, if I'm trying to be very optimistic, a transitional period, and perhaps moving into a Biden presidency, we might have a increased interest in the media as guardians of truth in slightly less floral language, but that sort of idea of media protecting what is a fundamental reality. I think in terms of alternative business models, I think that's perhaps a more difficult question to answer. We've seen so much vanishing of local news in particular, and I think we've seen a lot of, in the US in particular, the rise of what they call pink slime news sites, so partisan websites pretending to be local news. And one of them, one of the biggest, actually recently bought a paper, the first physical paper it acquired in, it's in Illinois, I think. But essentially, I'm really struggling to see at the moment how local media does make a comeback without, perhaps we've had ideas of government funding. And in some cases we've had sort of Patreon or sort of GoFundMe models. But I think the role of local media as that sort of connective tissue, which keeps people from relying on local chit chat 2.0 private groups, which are filled with very little good information, filled with lots of questionable content and questionably sourced photos. I think we do need to work on how to crack that. And that's not just a US problem, that's a UK problem as well. I think the way in which local media has been hollowed out and absorbed and asset stripped in many cases is really scary and underrated.
Okay, we've just had a flurry of questions come in. I'm going to take this one from Crystal, who I know is in the US, so it must be quite early there. So thank you for joining this conversation. Her question is, are social media platforms' efforts to block the disinformation and subsequently driving people to other platforms such as Parler, are those efforts just furthering the divide between various realities? I'm going to put that to Carl, if you would.
Good question, Crystal. We haven't seen, there's been a lot of hype around kind of platform migration for quite a long time now, and the kind of rise of the alt tech space. So far, we haven't actually seen a kind of meaningful movement of people outside of the mainstream. So this was a big fear when people like Milo Yiannopoulos got deplatformed. Everyone said Gab or Parler, is going to, Gab at that point would benefit, and he dragged lots of people with them. It turns out really that the platform effects of social media platforms are so powerful that people tend to stay where everyone else is. That means that what really happens when you deplatform a movement, as Facebook has done with QAnon, is that a very small hardcore kind of then get transposed onto Parler, and this kind of more mainstream, kind of like more casual membership basically stay on Facebook and go somewhere else. Very interesting question about what will happen on January the 20th. Because on January the 20th, Donald Trump loses a blanket protection that he has on Twitter to not ever get banned or receive anything other than the kind of interstitials, which you might have noticed they put on most of his tweets. That is going to be an absolute train wreck. Like, I can't see how they will not have to take him off the platform if they are able to say that, and he continues to act the way that he is now. That might genuinely precipitate some kind of more meaningful movement of people. Donald Trump might be the one person that can drag a lot of the alt-right onto a place like Parler. One word of warning, though, around all of this, which is that we can't just beat up the platforms. Platform regulation is super important, and they have to do a better job. And they've, to be honest with you, I think mainly have to do a better job outside of the US, really. It's in non-English, and it's in all the other elections around the world. I mean, they mobilized more resources for this election than I think they've ever done on a single event ever. They completely changed Twitter completely changed the way this platform worked. It tried to kill virals. You know, they surged moderators. They really did try. I mean, I don't think we can accuse the platforms of, you know, not noticing this was going to be a problem. They genuinely did mobilize quite a lot of stuff to try and protect this. Like, arguably not enough, arguably never enough. But the worst that they can do is to take stuff off their platforms. And that's never going to be a response which is going to solve this problem of information warfare. We've got to levy other costs and penalties. Otherwise, basically, the people that do this simply loop the cost of getting assets removed as just an occupational hazard. You know, they just price that into the campaigns. That's why we've got to come up with other responses as well. And then lastly, you know, the weaponization of hyperlocal news websites, standing their websites. This is really worrying me. You know, they're being bought up by dark money. They've got mastheads and brand names which people trust. You know, very local Kentuckian, you know, newspapers have been around for 120 years. They're suddenly spitting out a kind of endless stream of hyper-partisan drivel and nonsense under that masthead. And, you know, they don't necessarily need social media platforms per se to allow this to have influence. And very local specific influence. You know, they campaign against local judges or like local elected sheriffs and local officials, things like that. We don't see that at the national level, national journalists and researchers. I don't think we're really seeing like what's actually happening in terms of this kind of hyper-localized information warfare. And that's probably a lot more pernicious if you add it all up together. So yeah, sorry, those are my thoughts on the platforms. It is important, you know, and bring them under democratic control. We've been saying at Demos for almost a decade as well now. But you know, they're not going to solve this themselves, and us telling them to solve it isn't going to solve it.
I had a couple of questions on digital literacy and fact-checking. I'll put this to Christine. So fact-checking is obviously one of the avenues that all of these tech companies are going to as a mechanism to fight disinformation. But equally, they've been lumped in with big tech, right, and the conspiracy as well. They're kind of seen as you know, the part of the deep state. So how effective do you think fact-checking has been overall as a response, in particular from the perspective of people who need to use it, or the people who are maybe most vulnerable to these kind of conspiracies?
I think like in there, that's maybe so there is a philosophical question behind this, but there is also a technical question behind it. And I think I'd start with a technical question because it speaks both to Marianna's and Carl's point that they just raised. So fact-checking platforms can do in different ways. So for example, the way Facebook does fact-checking, let's say, and they attribute a label to there is a problem with this might be misinformation, is they do it in such a way that the label is being attached, but the post can be interacted with any other post. So you can like it, you can share it, and it's being recommended, and it can like gain like momentum, and it can spread. Whereas what Twitter often does when they put, for example, a tweet behind the label and they say like, it's because of some policy violation that this has been taking place, this is like not true, like you can't make certain claims, then what that does is it limits the amplification of that specific tweet. So what we can see here is you can't see who has interacted with it, you can't comment on it, and it's not going to be recommended or put into like any kind of like trend-like amplification. And I think that is very important distinction to make, is how those ideas of checking whether something is true or not, whether that actually has an effect or not on the platform. If it only comes with a label, I think people become very desensitized to seeing those labels. For example, if you go to Trump's Facebook page, you can see a lot of labels, but you can also just choose to click them away, and you can just keep scrolling, and it's just something that you see, and it doesn't like actually have that, it doesn't make the difference that they presumably want to have. Whereas on Twitter, this is a very different question because it has an effect and there is a consequence to the label. And I think that that is something important that we are seeing. I think the problem with truth, obviously, and what it means to fact check and to establish what that kind of truth is, as obviously the question is like, what happens afterwards? I think that very much is a question of general tendencies that we have seen in much more thinking about that there was some specific one truth that we have previously seen, like a kind of like more modernist kind of area. Then we have seen a fragmentation of truth, and now we're seeing a non-truth or a belief in false truths or no truth at all. And I think like that this kind of development that we're seeing here goes way beyond Trump and way beyond this US election, obviously, and it's something that needs to be conceptualized, I feel like, from taking like 3 steps back and seeing wider developments and how we can tackle this and change this. And certainly while labeling certain posts is one way of going about this, but that is very like a very small part of the larger story to be told here.
I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple more questions. So a question here from Olivia, which I'll put to Marianna. So Barack Obama in his recent interview, again, I think this is the David Olusoga one on the BBC, which is really, really good interview. I highly recommend it. So Barack Obama in his recent interview about his book talks of truth decay. Is this wider theme of distrust that is so pervasive in modern day culture a key reason for the rise of conspiracy theories? And how much of a threat do you think conspiracy belief poses for democracy in future elections? And that's quite interesting as well, because a lot of conspiracy theories obviously aren't new. They're not linked to the internet, and often they do have some sort of inkling of truth in it, right? Or there are examples of where the establishment have got it wrong. Take, for example, the Iraq war is a big reason why people don't trust the government. But looking towards the future as well, do you think that it is possible to try and come back from the brink and regain trust in establishments? I mean, even the BBC, there's a big defund the BBC campaign now, right? Kind of with the similar themes.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think that part of why conspiracy theories and disinformation prove so popular is in part due to that erosion of trust in institutions and people and places we've always trusted. And I think the history of that's quite complex. There's actually been some really good documentaries on the BBC about this in recent years, more related to Brexit, but to be honest, the same messages kind of apply to the pandemic, or if we're looking across to the US election, although a lot of them are more UK specific. But for instance, Harold Shipman or the expenses scandal or various instances like that did erode trust in experts and people and institutions that we otherwise might have trusted more in the past. And I think that it's a combination of that and then social media and what that does for kind of our own. One thing I hear all the time is, oh, I do my own research. I look into it myself. And I think that plays a massive role. I think big world events like an unprecedented coronavirus pandemic that make lots of people anxious and looking for kind of quick or satisfying answers to questions that don't have satisfying answers, in fact have very complex explanations that are quite hard for us to understand and process. I think it's a combination of all those things. And I think specifically the issue of the BBC, one thing I find when I receive abuse on social media is this kind of, the BBC has a specialist disinformation reporter, how Orwellian, you're telling us what to think, we don't trust the BBC, we hate the BBC. I mean, obviously this is often a kind of small group of quite hardcore trolls who send this kind of thing. But one of the arguments they bring up repeatedly is the issue of Jimmy Savile. And whenever I cover QAnon, Jimmy Savile is brought up again and again and again. And I think that it's a key part of conspiracy theories that they retrospectively consume events that explain their conspiracy. So for instance, Epstein or Savile are both terrible instances of child and human trafficking and abuse, with really dark consequences, and those have been, you know, called out quite frequently by the media as well. But that doesn't mean that every single person in power is running a child trafficking ring, and it's trying to explain that to people. And I think it kind of speaks to this point that we were discussing, that fact checking alone is not really enough, because the issue of erosion of trust is so crucial to this, that actually, you know, if I turn around to someone who's saying to me, well, the BBC obviously would say this because they covered up what Jimmy Savile did, but if I turn around and say, no, that's not the case, I think that was disgusting, etc., etc., that won't work. They'll just cherry pick another bit of their kind of arsenal of very complex YouTube research to put to me. So instead, it's much better to try and either understand why they're turning to these conspiracy theories and what's at the root of that, often a legitimate concern that's then quelled by this kind of conspiracy content on social media. And I think also trying to actually question the narratives themselves. I was recently talking to a taxi driver who said to me, oh, I'm sort of like a little bit intrigued by this, you know, why aren't the media covering this child abuse thing and all of these kids? And I said, well, can you explain a little bit more to me about this? And it became clear that he had come across QAnon, not really realizing that it was necessarily QAnon. And he was very kind of unwitting in he wasn't some kind of hardcore believer, but it had clearly sown seeds of doubt in his mind. And I think that what was really interesting was when I said to him, do you understand that all of the people who are targeted with these allegations of child abuse oppose President Trump? They're all people, they're not President Trump, who himself has been pictured with Epstein. And this guy was like, oh yeah, actually that does kind of make sense. And I was like, see, now can you understand that this is part of a political disinformation campaign because it doesn't target the other side? And he was like, oh, that does make sense. So I think that can be a really effective way of addressing conspiracies as we go forwards.
That's fascinating. Unfortunately, we are out of time, despite there being so much more to talk about. I think a key message is that there's a lot more to be done, and this is possibly going to become a significantly more challenging issue in the future. Another message I would like to add is everyone should read think tank reports. You never know what might be in there, right? 10 years time, what we're talking about today. But finally, I'd just like to thank our excellent panelists and also everyone who took the time to join this call and participate. And given that this is the last event, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's ever attended any event and ever supported WebRoots Democracy in any way over the last 6 years. It's been very much appreciated. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.